Hello, and welcome back to the Caliphs, the rise and fall of Arab power. My name is Zaid Wahab, and today we're going to follow the dysfunction in Baghdad as we approach the end of the Abbasid age. As we heard last time, ultimate authority was no longer in the hands of the Caliph, but was now the purview of a newly minted position, that of Amir al-Umara, or Commander of the Commanders. The first man to fill this role was Ibn Ra'iq, but the fractious situation in Iraq meant he would have to contend with several other aspirants if he hoped to hold on to it. Strap in for a chaotic, bloody downward spiral in episode 88, Amir al-Umara. I've hinted at this before, dear listeners, but this time I'm just going to come out and say it. Our journey is all but over. As far as I can tell, this will be the penultimate narrative episode. Two of the three classical histories I chose as the base source material for this podcast have long been exhausted. Al-Yaqubi's in episode 74 and Al-Tabari in episode 82. And although Al-Mas'udi's work covers three Abbasids subsequent to Al-Radi, it is quite dismissive of the caliphs themselves, as they were little more than figureheads by this point. The only reason we're still going is because the transition to foreign rule of the caliphate under Buwayhid overlordship is close at hand, and that seems like a less arbitrary terminus for our long project. Before we take up the narrative again, there's one last thing I want to note. After listening to the previous episode, I began to feel like we're a little too zoomed in for this concluding part of our time together. While covering things in detail is fine and all, it's more appropriate for us to stop sweating the small stuff so much and to begin considering the wider sweep of the collapse instead. This isn't me trying to skimp on you or anything. I just hate for us to spend time and attention covering a cast of minor characters in detail, only for our narrative to come to an abrupt end before their stories do. On top of that, you'll see how this period had a furious, near comical pace of betrayals and counter-coups, and it would be dizzying to focus on the fortunes of every contender for Amir al-Umara that we come across. That said, let's pick up where we left off, with Ibn Ra'iq in full control of the caliphate as its first supreme commander. He first rode into Baghdad to assume the position in late 936, and his earliest moves were to consolidate all authority in his hands, eliminating both the caliph's personal guard and the wazir Ali ibn Muqla. We've already covered how Ibn Ra'iq's rise to power had been enabled by a couple key allies, namely his military chiefs, Bajkam and Tuzun, and his financiers, the wealthy Baridi family of Basra. These men were rewarded with key positions in the state. Bajkam became leader of the caliphate's armies with Tuzun as his deputy, and the scion of the Baridi family, Abu Abdullah, was named wazir. This looked really solid on paper. The caliphate finally had a formidable army and a rich administrator who was fluent in finance. While territorially much diminished from its heyday, between the three of them, these men could speak for Basra, Wasit, and now Baghdad. It seemed inevitable that they would turn their attention towards the last rogue city in Iraq, Mosul, and against its Hamdanid overlords. Alas, it was not to be, this being the age of collapse and all. Ibn Ra'iq, Bajkam, and Abu Abdullah were just allies of convenience, far more interested in accumulating personal power than they were in working towards the greater good of all. Although assessments of the motives and characters of the last two vary in the sources I've come across, Ibn Ra'iq is universally detested. Surprisingly, Beckham, the Turkish mercenary who started his career by betraying the Caspian lord, is the one who is most often cast as a champion of Abbasid power, while Abu Abdullah receives mixed reviews. I'll let you make up your own mind on those two, because no matter how you cut it, Ibn Ra'iq was the worst thing for the realm since the child caliph al-Muqtadir. Things went wrong for our supreme commander almost immediately. It didn't take Abu Abdullah al-Baridi very long to realize that his appointment as wazir was in name only. It quickly became clear that Ibn Ra'iq cared little for his administrative input and was only interested in his family's fabulous wealth. When Abu Abdullah refused to simply let it all be confiscated, the Baridis were declared enemies of the state, and Ibn Ra'iq sent Beckham south to deal with them by force. In order to motivate his general, Ibn Ra'iq declared Beckham governor of all he could conquer, hoping that that would incentivize him to wrest Basra from the renegade wazir's family. The battle-hardened Beckham performed admirably, despite lacking his opponent's material resources. Starting his campaign in Wasit in February 937, he scored a couple unexpected victories and ousted the Baridis from their home city of Basra, chasing them east into Khuzestan. Beckham followed that impressive achievement up with another, and by the summer he had almost taken full control of the province. His success left the Baridis desperate, and they promised a handsome reward to any commander who could help them turn the tide against their erstwhile allies. Luckily for them, the Buwayhids had already established control in nearby Faris, and they were willing to lend a hand for the right price. The Baridis thus hired them to repel Beckham's forces, marking the first time the eventual masters of the caliphate drew steel against its armies. Beckham was no match for the Buwayhids, and in late 937 he and his men hightailed it back to the safety of the fortified city of Wasit, forfeiting all the gains they'd made in the months they spent at war. The only good news for the caliphate was that the Baridis and the Buwayhids also had a falling out. The rich Basran family thought it had paid its mercenaries for their services, but the latter decided that they would just keep all they'd conquered. Luckily for the Baridis, the Buwayhids had no interest in Basra, and so everything had gone back to square one. From his luxurious estate in Baghdad, Ibn Ra'iq again wrote to Beckham, ordering him to retake everything he'd lost and promising to make him governor once more. But once bitten, twice shy. Instead of heeding the word of Amir al-Umara, the general chose to betray him. He secretly got in touch with the Baridis and forged an alliance against Ibn Ra'iq. Abu Abdullah was promised the vizierate and the governorship of both Wasit and Basra in return for his support against Amir al-Umara. His southern flank thus protected, Beckham made for Baghdad in the north in September 938. Ibn Ra'iq had no real forces with which to repel this advance. After all, the general was the military workhorse he'd ridden all the way to the top. The desperate Amir al-Umara looked to the example of his former superior, the illustrious Mu'nis. Drawing inspiration from his masterful defense of Baghdad during the invasion of the Qaramita over a decade back, Ibn Ra'iq ordered the breaching of all the dams that controlled the flow of the Nahrawan Canal. This ruinous decision is singled out in our sources for its destructiveness and ineffectuality. The flooding that ensued wiped out what little was left of Iraq's agricultural output, and did absolutely nothing to halt the advance of Beckham's forces, which marched into the capital unopposed. Unsurprisingly, al-Radi wasted no time in conferring upon Beckham the title of Amir al-Umara. What is surprising, however, is Ibn Ra'iq's survival. I would have thought that after dooming the land to centuries of food scarcity and insecurity, he'd at least be thrown in jail. But it seems he fled like he always did. Don't forget about him yet, though, because believe it or not, he makes a comeback, despite his horrendous track record. For now, however, let's turn our attention to the latest Supreme Commander. Baghdad assumed control of Baghdad and the Caliphate in September 938. He started out a little better than Ibn Ra'iq. Instead of immediately turning on his allies in Basra, he sought to cement his ties to Abu Abdullah al-Baridi by marrying his daughter. Just a month later, he personally led the Caliphate's armies north against the Hamdanids alongside the Caliph. His forces took Mosul without much of a fight, as the Hamdanid chief Hassan ibn Hamdan opted to flee and hide in a remote part of Mesopotamia. Although the Caliphate's forces pursued him for several months, they never managed to corner him, and a guerrilla war waged against them by local Kurds and Arab tribes began to take its toll. Baghdad may have persevered until victory had it not been for some truly distressing news from Baghdad. The treacherous Ibn Ra'iq had conspired with the Qaramita, convincing 1,000 of them to raid and occupy the capital while its caliph and defenders were away. As soon as Baghdad and the caliph learned about this audacious gambit, they received a letter from Ibn Ra'iq. In return for leading the Qaramita out of Baghdad, he only wanted two things: a general pardon and to be installed as governor in charge of some Syrian cities. Uncertain of their ability to defeat him in battle, they opted to accept his terms, and in February 939, the Qaramita left and the caliph returned to his looted capital. Despite a promising start, after this failed campaign in the north, Baghdad's tenure began to look a lot like his predecessors. This resemblance grew further when the supreme commander fell out with his father-in-law, Abu Abdullah al-Baridi. Now, how this came about is one of those details I was hoping to skip, but I'll give you a general idea real quick. It seems Abu Abdullah had aspirations for becoming the true power in the land, and he was somehow using the Buwayhids against the Caliphate. Some say he bribed them to attack, to weaken Baghdad further, but it's more likely that he provoked them without the approval of Amir al-Umara. In 939, Baghdad successfully defended against some Buwayhid incursions in the south, then he hoped to put an end to them by invading from their north instead. Early next year, he mounted an assault against Jubal, but was soundly defeated by their superior armies. This must have been the point when he suspected his father-in-law's complicity, because not only did he remove Abu Abdullah as wazir and governor by August 940, but he personally led a campaign against his wealthy family. The Baridis abandoned Wasit without a fight, but they prepared to defend their claim to Basra and its environs. In December 940, while Baghdad was camped in Wasit planning his attack against Abu Abdullah, news of al-Radi's death came from Baghdad. The barely perceptible caliph had managed what his father and uncle before him had failed to do. He met a natural end. Even though he nominally presided over 6 years of relentless collapse, he is remembered glowingly in al-Mas'udis and other histories. We've covered several examples of caliphs receiving unearned praise, and time and again, it's come down to them looking good relative to what came after. This is the case with al-Radi once more. In fact, it's especially acute this time because there was no recovery of Abbasid power. Al-Radi was the last caliph to deliver Friday sermons. He was the last caliph to leave behind lines of verse. He was even the last caliph to hold court, although it should be noted that his was devoid of any military, political, or administrative figures, and it was only attended by poets and singers and the like. Histories may depict al-Radi respectfully, but Baghdad does not seem to have been too bothered about his passing. The supreme commander didn't even make the trip back to Baghdad to confirm Abbasid's successor. he delegated the task to a secretary who selected al-Radi's younger brother, Ibrahim ibn al-Muqtadir. The 32-year-old was dubbed al-Muttaqi billah, he who seeks refuge in God, and that's pretty much all we hear about him for a while. Given this podcast's title, I feel like maybe I should spend a little more time on him, but I don't want to distract our discussion with such trifling details. If you thought these whirlwind years were confusing and difficult to keep up with, brace yourself for 941, in which 4 different men held the title of Amir al-Umara. The year started with Baghdad in charge, and like we said, he was engaged in a campaign against the Baridi family. Their latest tactic was to use their navy, yes, they were rich enough to own one by now, to blockade the Tigris and Euphrates and stop any traffic from sailing upriver to Baghdad. Baghdad orchestrated the caliphate's campaign against them from Wasit, while his top general Tuzun was trusted to lead the armies in his stead. Tuzun's struggle to make headway convinced Baghdad to take to the field as well, and he mobilized against his foes in April 941. The Baridis were saved by a stroke of luck. While out on a hunt with a few of his men, Baghdad was ambushed and killed by unnamed brigands. The sudden death of the supreme commander led to a power vacuum which sent shockwaves throughout the realm. Without Baghdad at the helm, the army he held together split along ethnic lines into 2 equally potent forces, the Daylamites and the Turks. The Turks, led by Tuzun, returned to their former master Ibn Ra'iq, while the Daylamites chose to ally themselves with the Baridi family instead. The latter now had an easy time marching right into the undefended capital and claimed Baghdad for themselves, possibly in May. Abu Abdullah was named Amir al-Umara, but he was usurped by the leader of the Daylamite troops who had championed his claim in July, a fellow named Kortakin. Kortakin allowed his men to mercilessly pillage Baghdad, prompting the caliph to secretly write to Ibn Ra'iq asking for help. In August or September, Ibn Ra'iq marched his forces into the capital, and after a couple days of heavy fighting, the Turks proceeded to massacre the Daylamites. Ibn Ra'iq was thus once again declared Amir al-Umara, with less than half the men he had last time, and without his dependable general Baghdad. In October 941, Ibn Ra'iq moved his forces to Wasit and ordered Tuzun to invade the Baridi positions in the south. The Turks depended on Tuzun to make sure that they were paid, though, and Ibn Ra'iq didn't seem to have anything for them other than dangerous missions against much richer and better equipped opponents. Care to guess what happened next? That's right, yet another betrayal. Tuzun switched his support over to the Baridis, who now enjoyed the upper hand. Unable to match them on the battlefield, Ibn Ra'iq resorted to negotiation, and a fragile peace was worked out in late 941. Abu Abdullah was again named Wazir, this time with promises of true authority. But surprise, surprise, Ibn Ra'iq's promises proved hollow. Mere months after the negotiated accords between them, the Supreme Commander declared that the Baridis ought to be cursed at mosques across the land. I'm not sure why Ibn Ra'iq chose to pull the trigger when he knew all he had was an empty chamber. He turned against Abu Abdullah in February 942, and the Baridis lay waste to his relatively meager forces the next month, taking the capital yet again. Ibn Ra'iq and the caliph were forced to flee to Mosul, and they placed themselves under the protection of the Hamdanids while Baghdad was plunged into some of its darkest days yet. Its new regime plundered the city so ruthlessly that over 10,000 people are said to have died in the 100 days it reigned between March and June of that year. It's a little ironic that the caliph and Ibn Ra'iq now turned to the Hamdanids for safety, considering that only a couple years back they were more of a target to be subdued than a shelter from the storm. The Hamdanids were welcoming, however, and their leader, Hassan ibn Hamdan, graciously took the pair in. After learning more about the caliph's situation, Hassan decided to do all he could to help. His first move was an obvious one. He had the troublesome Ibn Ra'iq unceremoniously put to death and was promptly declared the new Amir al-Umara by the exiled al-Muttaqi. While they plotted their assault on the capital, the Hamdanids scored an unexpected victory against their foes. The ruinous mismanagement of Baghdad by the Baridis had convinced Tuzun that he could no longer trust them, and he once again switched sides along with what remained of his loyal Turks. Hassan ibn Hamdan attacked Baghdad in June 942, but having already pillaged the city, the Baridi forces withdrew before his arrival. The Hamdanids pursued them, and a bloody battle was fought about 30 miles south of the city, one that led to great losses on both sides. The Baridis fled south, but the Hamdanids did not have enough men and resources to pursue them to Basra to deal the final blow. Hassan tried to do so, but morale fell to such dangerously low levels that the Hamdanid no longer trusted his grumbling Turkish troops. He abandoned first the campaign, then the capital, and his position as Amir al-Umara in May 943, content to be chief of the Hamdanids in Mesopotamia instead. The mutinous Turks rallied behind their leader, Tuzun, who occupied the capital in June and became the caliphate's latest supreme commander. I think this is a good spot to take our last pause before we conclude our narrative next time. The pace of disorder had been growing quicker for decades, and it seems to have crescendoed after al-Radi's reign. The Abbasid Caliphate wasn't one of many forces fighting for survival in this era. It was more like a white elephant claimed by rivals warring for control of Iraq. Apart from the legitimacy conferred by the caliph, there was hardly any benefit to being Amir al-Umara. Baghdad was impoverished and starving. Protecting it cost more than it paid. That's why it kept being tossed around between Ibn Ra'iq, his commanders, the Baridis, and the Hamdanids. It was like a hot potato that none could hold on to while there were other forces to be reckoned with. I'm not quite sure what to focus on in this reflective part of our time together. In the absence of a strong caliph, I can usually at least list and lament some of the factors that were getting in the way. But this is clearly a time of total and unrestrained collapse. The way al-Radi and al-Muttaqi are depicted in our sources is more a function of how the authors chose to reflect on their own heritage as Arabs, rather than anything these Abbasids actually stood for themselves. They were not allowed to exercise any social and political agency. So when al-Mas'udi tells us that al-Radi secretly plotted with Bajkam to rid himself of Ibn Ra'iq, I really don't know what to do with that. It goes against the grain of the powerlessness which permeates everything else we hear about the caliph, so I can't just pass it along as fact. Ultimately, these Abbasid caliphs probably did have desires for power. And who knows, maybe even certain designs on it too. But they simply had no means for advancing such aims. So I don't see the point in describing the pent-up fantasies of impotent nobles. Maybe I'm being too hard on the disappointing ruling clan, but let's move on all the same. The new role of Supreme Commander changed hands at a furious pace today. First, we had Ibn Ra'iq for 2 years, then Bajkam for 3. His unexpected death led to the quick succession that followed. Abu Abdullah al-Baridi for like a day, Kortakin, sometimes referred to as Kuranchik, for 2 months, Ibn Ra'iq again for another 6 months, Hassan ibn Hamdan for about a year, before Tuzun claimed it by mid-943. There were no fundamental changes after these volatile years. Tuzun still faced the Hamdanids in the north and the Baridis in the south. The only difference was that everybody was a lot poorer and weaker now. Well, everyone except the Buwayhids in the east, who in retrospect seem to have been wisely focused on securing their grip over most of what we today call Iran. I tried and failed to find good estimates of army sizes in the last few conflicts. Ranges, however, are an order lower than the sizes we used to hear about, even after the anarchy in Samarra. It seems like major armies ranged in the low thousands. Bechgam may have commanded about 2,000 men, and his combined host, as in the Turks and the Daylamites together, may have reached double that estimate. The largest armies I read about were the ones assembled under the generous patronage of the Baridi family. But even then, I never came across a number higher than 14,000, with the average just shy of about 10. The lack of a large royal army was a symptom of the age. In its absence, minor lordlings had a real chance of holding on to their domains independently, at least so long as they could keep their ambitious neighbors at bay. A force a few hundred strong usually sufficed, and the proliferation of such swords for hire made the caliphate a far more dangerous place. Provinces had not forwarded their taxes in decades, and any governor with enough wealth found that investing it in more mercenaries was a sound strategy for growing their own domain. We've been focused on the internecine struggle over Iraq, but it was the same elsewhere, only less deadlocked. The governor of Damascus, for example, son of a Turkish commander who had served alongside Mu'nis, did particularly well. In a chaotic journey to the top that involved gaining and losing first Syria, then Egypt, he eventually founded a dynasty that ruled over both provinces. It lasted for a little over 30 years, all of which were overseen by his personal attendant, who dominated the state after his master's passing. I didn't intend for us to stray into other topics, one which I'm not going to cover in much detail. I just wanted to highlight the wider repercussions of the collapse. We've been focused on Iraq in order to keep an eye on the Abbasids as their relevance fades completely. Their caliphate was no longer even the only one, however. There was the Umayyad Caliphate in Qartawa and the Fatimid Caliphate in North Africa. Now that Baghdad was no longer a force to be reckoned with, all sorts of smaller polities could flourish, or at least experiment with self-rule or alternative forms of governance. That's basically what Iraq was going through. And we'll discover how it finally found some political stability next time, here on The Caliphs, the rise and fall of Arab power.